Let's talk about graphic arts in this mid 1400s. The Book of Hours is probably the most famous one. It replaces the traditional Psalter, which was the only liturgical book that was in private hands until about the mid 13th century. This really becomes possible because of paper mills. Paper had already previously been invented, but it's not used on a regular basis until we have paper mills that makes it readily available and economically possible. So the Book of Hours is meant to be read usually privately to lead you in worship. There are prayers that you can recite. There are excerpts from the Bible. There are several psalms, penitential psalms of different types. There are excerpts from the four Gospels. It's also a calendar, but it was also illuminated. So there were painters, and we have unusually illusionistic scenes. It was meant to be read privately, and most aristocratic families in the 14th and 15th century would have had a copy, and many times their children learned to read from them. Sometimes you often see in the backs there are pages with alphabets on them. Let's talk a little bit about woodcuts, and this is a couple of pages from the Nuremberg Chronicle around 1490s. There were large pages of text, and sometimes open, empty areas were left blank on purpose so that a woodcut could be placed in, so that you have some imagery in this particular area. This is possible. Type beforehand was hand-done or hand-carved in wood, which is very laborious. But around this time period, if you know your history, Gutenberg invents movable type. Not necessarily the printing press, but movable type, meaning there are different pieces of letters that can be moved around so that you can reuse that same metal type. As I mentioned earlier, paper also became really important. So we really start to see paper 1085 perhaps in Spain. France has one of the earliest paper mills in 1190. And then we see the famous paper mill in Fabriano, Italy, that still makes paper today in 1276. Those mills are established. And then it spreads to northern Italy, goes to Holland and Germany by the 1350s. And then in Nuremberg, the 1390s, is where we see a mill set up. So woodcuts are established in China first in the 7th century, but that's not spread to Europe. They also had invented paper and had been making paper, but Europe doesn't see this invention until later. 15th century woodcuts on paper become really popular. You might also see them, and a common everyday person could also buy one of these. The one on the left is a woodcut of St. Christopher. So anyone could probably afford to buy one of these, an ordinary person. Playing cards were also common, woodcuts. There's another example on the right from kind of illustrating some biblical scenes here. This is a beautiful example of the Gutenberg Bible, one of the first printed books ever, a great feat. There were possibly 180 copies made of the Gutenberg Bible, but only 48 of these copies really survive, and 11 of them are on vellum. This is the one that is in the first copy to the United States in 1847, brought over by James Lennox. The beauty of movable type and the printing press and paper, of course, is that multiple images could be produced, and therefore you could have multiple originals, and you could create many that could be published and produced and pushed into the hands of the public. So let's talk a little bit in depth about engraving. We're going to look at several artists that use engraving as a medium. Woodcuts obviously are on wood, and engravings you can get a lot more detail than you can in woodcuts, but it's a very intricate process. You have a copper plate, you have tools. The tools to the right here are called burins, and you would draw and then carve into this copper plate, and your lines would be sunken in. You would ink it, and that ink would sink into those lines, and you would wipe off the excess ink. put a layer of moistened paper on top, and then run it through a press. So this pressure would force the paper down into those lines that have been carved, and ink would stick on it. It creates the reverse, however, so that's why the type is backwards. So this takes quite a bit of skill to be able to be an engraver. Martin Schongauer from Germany is a very wonderful engraver. He's a painter as well, but his engravings are much stronger, and he influences early engravers. We're going to talk about Albrecht Durer later, and you'll want to remember Martin Schongauer because Durer is highly influenced by him, as are others, including Michelangelo, in the High Renaissance. This is depicting the Temptation of St. Anthony. It's a story from the Golden Legend that talks about saints' lives, and this was really popular. Anthony was a popular theme among those who were suffering because he was tempted and tortured, and you see him here trying to withstand the temptations of these beasts that are surrounding him. And Schongauer creatively interprets these beasts into kind of elegant reptile-like creatures, but it's quite a harrowing experience. This is full of action, even though Anthony is in the middle without much expression. But notice that they are flying in the air. There's a rock at the very bottom right, but they're mid-air. He's also using some cross-hatching to indicate some depth. So notice that cross-hatching in St. Anthony's robe. There's just some hatching in the top portion of the sky to give us an idea of space. This was so admired by Michelangelo that he made a copy of it.